Welcome to Everyone Deserves Sunshine. I'm Diana.
And I'm Anusha. We're the girls in the crease. And today we are going to be joined once again by Dr. Tabitha Dell'Angelo to talk more about identity because we're never done with this subject, right, Diana?
Well, we're talking about Ilya today.
That's
so,
right.
that makes me really excited. So I'm looking forward to that. So, should we get to it?
Yeah, let's get started.
Joining us today is Dr. Tabitha Dell'Angelo, the same Tabitha who joined us last week to talk about Shane's identity through the Bronfenbrenner's framework. Today, we are talking about Ilya's identity, which we're super excited about, as always, and we are using a slightly different framework. So, Tab, do you want to tell us about the framework we're using today to discuss Ilya? Because it's something both Anusha and I are not completely, totally familiar with, but we did do our homework, but still you are the experts.
So PVEST stands for Phenomenological Variant of Ecological Systems Theory. So Bronfenbrenner was the ecological systems theory. This is the phenomenological variant. What phenomenology is asking us to do in this context is to see development through the eyes of the individual. So when we talk about Ilya from a PVEST perspective, we want to sort of imagine what it's like to be Ilya. There's 5 components to the theory, and rather than looking at the whole system, although obviously it's part of the system, but this is really thinking about development in a very more personal way.
If we said last week the Bronfenbrenner system was to think about not who Shane is, but why Shane is the way he is. This system is how are you the way you are, given the cards you've been dealt with?
The architect of this theory is a woman named Margaret Beale Spencer. Margaret Beale Spencer is still alive. So she was my dissertation advisor. I feel really lucky. She was my mentor. And as she learns more, which is what we should do in science, she's tweaking, right? And so originally that first component was just called risks. And now it's called net vulnerability. And so in that component, it'll say risks and protective factors. And so what we're asking folks to do to think about your identity, so everything that you were just sort of initially born into the world with, right? So your gender, your neighborhood, your family socioeconomic status, even family dynamics, right? Is it a 2-parent household? Is it a 1-parent household? Do you have, 2 dads? Do you have 2 moms? Whatever it is, it's stuff that it wasn't earned, you didn't cause it, but this is the hand you're dealt. Right. And so that is, that's true for all of us, no matter where you are. Certainly with Ilya being born in Russia, I was looking up some statistics. You probably know this already, but in 1989, they surveyed folks in Russia. 31% of Russians said gay people should be executed. Now, I know that that's prior to Ilya being born, but that's the experience of his parents, right? So if they have a child who, who's gay, that's really scary in this place. And then they did it again in 1994, and it went down to 23%. But still, 23% of Russians in 1994 were gay people should be executed. And then 24% said they should be isolated, right? So this is just the country he was born into. And then, of course, Shane is born into Canada, still not perfect, but way more progressive. And the next component is about, they call it stress, net stress. So what are the challenges and what are the supports, right? And so, and then it's how do I cope with these things? And then it's based on how I cope, how's my identity developing? And then based on how my identity develops, what are my outcomes, right? And then those outcomes become the net vulnerability again, right? So if I am a successful athlete, now that's a part of my identity. Now I earn that, but it's still now going to feed into how I deal with stress, how I cope, right? So, and it's just this cyclical model.
Okay, so you walked us through the whole PVEST framework, but now let's meander through it through the eyes of heated rivalry. The first pillar, which is what? Net vulnerability, the hand you were
Mhm.
dealt. For me, the scene that really encapsulates that is when Ilya's dad in episode 1, where he says, "You listen, don't speak, understand." And he says it in Russian in front of the Boston Raiders owner. And then he says something not flattering about Ilya in English to the owner. And even if there were no subtitles, you could tell from the tone and the way he spoke that it was very demeaning right away. And I felt
Mhm.
like this is the highlight moment of his life, number 1 draft pick at his party, and this is the way his dad is talking to him now. So, I don't know what his net vulnerability looks like through those, like,
Well, it's
18
interesting,
years.
right? Because much like our discussion about Shane, like we don't necessarily know what life was
Yeah.
like before,
Yeah.
right? We can, we can imply based on or
Right.
infer based on clues. Um, but you can imagine that even though he's a high level athlete and he's being recruited into this prestigious position in the NHL, he probably is pretty submissive to his dad. I don't claim to know everything about Russian culture, but I do get the idea that there is this like hyper masculinity and dad's in charge, and that, Ilya's probably, in terms of like immersion identity, is his identity is he's the kid, right? But it's interesting because what getting this position in the NHL gives him is it gives him power, because now he's earning his own money, he's getting notoriety. So his identity can evolve to a point, and we see it in the series, to where he starts to assert his own independence a little bit. But still, when somebody from home calls, everything gets put aside. That you could tell there's a lot of heaviness with that. When we think about stress level, right? Stress and protective factors. This is a kid that probably had a high level of stress all the time. And that's not really normal. Like, it's normal to have ebbs and flows of stress. But what I infer from his childhood, from his mom probably having mental illness, she took her own life, dad having this hypermasculinity, all his high expectations, that his cortisol levels were probably always high. And that sucks. And then, even though he gets some power with the transition into the NHL, he's still living this double life. That is stressful every day, right? And so I feel a lot of empathy for Ilya, which might be surprising because I used to call Diana like an Ilya apologist. But the
I
more
cannot wait for this conversation right now. I cannot wait. I have been waiting to fight you on this forever.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, like, the more I thought about him, the more I really thought about his development and his level of net stress, because it's challenges and supports. And when I think about what I can infer about his life, he's got more challenges than supports. He
Huh.
certainly has protective factors,
Mhm.
but and his temperament and the way he copes, he's able to like make it work. He doesn't fall apart. And in fact, he's really resilient. Like, in the end, we see that despite his developmental trajectory, he's very resilient.
Mhm.
But it took me a while to get there, because that's not where I started with Ilya.
Mhm. Okay, my
Mhm.
turn, my turn, my turn, my turn. Okay, Tab, do you remember when you were, like, calling Ilya an asshole and I was getting really upset? And you're like, "We can disagree, Diana. There's no reason for you to get upset." And I'm like, I just don't understand how someone like you, who is a professor of education, a professor of teacher of teachers, can look at someone like Ilya and just like, yep, that man's an asshole, without really understanding where he comes from. Because to me, it was so obvious. I really do think that it has a lot to do with like the cultural identity, right? And seeing the Russian man that I very well understand immediately. Part of the reason I didn't want to watch the show to begin with, because I'm like, I don't like the way Russians are represented and I don't want to see it again. So when I see Ilya in that scene, Anusha, that you're describing with his dad off to the side, you don't even see his dad. You only see Ilya's face, right? Only see his like disassociating from the fact that he's there and being berated by his dad when he literally just got first draft pick. And his dad's like, don't be lazy. And I'm sure that happened all the time with
Yep.
him, all the
And,
time.
like, because the other people know that it's not a
You're getting
nice
you're
thing.
getting berated, right? Because if
Yes.
you weren't getting berated, it would be in English. You know, everybody would be able to understand, right? I had a visceral response to every interaction with him and his dad. And when I saw that scene, it was like a gut punch. Like looking at his face, knowing the culture, knowing how Russian men are, like this is how they are. They're like closed off, they're not emotionally available. They're, hyper toxic masculine, most of them anyway. Like I grew up in some versions of that. And I just like, this was not like a shock to me when I saw him, like when I saw how he talks to Ilya, because honestly, boys like Ilya who have potential are almost always going to be even more berated by the family because you're going to get the fuck out of here, not for you, for us. You're going to become financially stable so you could help us. The fact that homophobia is ingrained in it is part of the fibers of Russian Soviet, society. The fact that his dad is like the very stereotypical Russian man whose kids, especially his boys, can never do right, no matter how successful they are. The fact that he calls them lazy, I just like I felt sick. It's one of the reasons I stopped watching after the first episode. Like I just like I'm like I don't want this shit, hitting me in the
Mhm.
face like
It's
I
very
know it
real.
too well. It's too much. And I actually thought like is Ilya going to be so fucked up by that he's just going to be this fucked up character the entire time because like that
Mhm.
can happen, that
Well,
happens
he
often.
could have been. And so I
Yeah.
will
Mhm.
just say this in my defense, that I do think that there's a difference between a reason and an excuse. So I
Mm.
understood that his developmental trajectory and his upbringing may be the reason, or even his culture, the way he was taught to be a man or whatever it is, that may be the reason. What I worried about is that we were going to excuse potentially abusive behavior, because when I
Mhm.
was first watching the show, I was like, "Oh, is he gonna be an abusive partner to Shane?"
Mm.
And that was my reaction, was like, "Well, even if his culture and his, what he's learned to believe is, the way men are supposed to act, I don't wanna excuse abusive behavior because just because I understand the reason why, right?"
Right.
And so now as the show progresses, you see that's not really what, but I think that was my my reaction. And truthfully, and I think this happens with lots of people, but I'll just speak for myself, I've had abusive relationships. It was like a little
Mhm.
triggering for me to be like, "Oh no, we're not gonna excuse that just because we know why." Like, you know what I
Right.
mean? So, and when we think about like, intersectional identities, he's also multilingual, right? So,
Mhm.
so there's all these intersections that impede their ability to seamlessly communicate, right?
Mhm.
And so that's stress. That's a stressful situation. And then how do they cope with it? And I do think for the most part, they really learn over time. And Ilya in particular gets really good at adaptive coping. But,
Mhm.
there's also adaptive coping in a maladaptive environment. And I
Mm.
think that you could argue that his upbringing was maladaptive. And he
Mm.
may have coped in ways that on paper we would say are maladaptive, but actually they were protective. It's like what he had to do. Right.
Yeah.
And so, even his relationship with his brother for many years, he's like bailing the family out and he's sending money and whatever. And you'd be like, you know what? Tough love, cut him off. But it's adaptive in this maladaptive family dynamic until he can't do it anymore, right? And then he finally changes that pattern.
But, like, he's only able to do that after his dad dies, right? He's
Mm,
only able to cut ties with his family after his dad dies, and that's for a reason. Again, that's culture. Family is everything. Like, it doesn't matter if you have the worst family ever. Your job is to still do whatever needs to be done for that family. When I came here and as I was growing up, like, I didn't understand this whole, like, I cut out my parents. I'm like, "What the fuck does that even mean? How do you just, like, cut off family?" Like, I never understood that, and I always was just like, "This is just an American thing. I don't get it," you know? So that's why when people are like, "Why doesn't he tell his brother to fuck off?" I'm like, "It just is not part of the culture." Western people may be like, "Boundaries," but, like, there's no boundaries. There are no boundaries in Russian culture when it comes to families. There's no space between. The reason he's able to move away from his family is only because the patriarch is officially gone. That's the only thing that frees him. His NHL career doesn't free him. The fact that he lives half of the time in
Mhm.
Boston, oceans away, does not free him. The only thing that frees him is the death of his father. And at that moment, he's like, fuck you. I'm leaving. You could have all of this shit. Leave me alone. Don't talk to me again.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that like I hear what you're saying, and um, I think that's true in a lot of cultures, even like Italian American cultures,
Yeah.
like But do you think there is a variable of because he's now exposed to other cultures that with different expectations that you also see possibilities that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise seen if you were only in your immediate culture?
I think so. I mean, I really, really think this is true. I think there's an element of like if you see another culture, you may be impacted. Like, how are you not? Like, you cannot not be no matter
Yeah.
how.
But there's still I do think there's still, like, because proximity is part of it, except that even though Ilya's dad was really far, Ilya's dad had a lot of power. I think Diana's right, like, when Ilya's dad dies, he doesn't feel as obligated to his brother. He probably still
Yes.
does to some degree, but
Yeah.
the proximity probably helps, the power dynamic is different.
But we also got to
Yeah, it's just
remember
really
that
interesting.
Ilya is not an American or a Canadian citizen either, right?
Yes.
So even though he is, quote, released from that family dynamic and that Russian culture in his family, he's not released from Russia. And that's why he says, I want to not have a Russian passport. So,
Uh-huh.
Tab,
Mhm.
to your point, even though he's in Boston or, traveling all over the United States and Canada, I think he sees like the possibilities. And that's what makes him want to get rid of the Russian passport. Once he starts seeing like Shane's family and how supportive they are and like what it could be, obviously that's going to change. At the same time, a lot of that culture is going to be ingrained in you and forever. Like, listen, we've lived here for 30 plus years. And like some of the things my dad says, I'm like, dude, you've been here for 30 plus years. Like, cut this shit. I came here when I was young, obviously. So anything that could have been ingrained in me, that's been gone, right? Even though I grew up in a very culturally Russian home, and so I felt it all, but, like, America was like, "No, you're gonna do better," and, like, so I did better, but I'm just saying, doesn't mean that you're gonna let go of all of your culture, and you don't have to,
Mhm.
I'm just saying, it doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily change your, life stage outcomes.
When I'm reading all these developmental theories, the thing that always comes to mind, and these are always obviously multifactorial, there's so much cross pollination. But if you think about Ilya and his brother, they grew up in the same kind of household, right? And Ilya is like, I fundamentally felt like he was different than his brother was when or his father was. And we meet them. There was some indication in him that this was going to be a different person than those two men. And I often wonder when you're in these similar environments, especially if you're of similar age, like the brothers, what was it that moved them so far in their identities and sense of self? Like, how would this system explain that, for
Well, I
example?
mean, I don't know that much about his brother. I don't know if you all know more from books, but part of it has to be his physical prowess, his athletic ability. So from, a net vulnerability like a protective factor, like one of his protective factors was that he had this talent that was recognized, that was valued, and that despite whatever obstacles were in his way, his family was willing to, provide opportunities for him to play hockey and because that's not nothing. Like so that probably was one of the biggest protective factors for Ilya because he had an opportunity that maybe his brother didn't have. And we do sort of see in those scenes, especially those later scenes, the brother seems really resentful.
Mhm.
That like Ilya's helping, but like he's not appreciative. He's like, this is expected and how
Right.
dare you? And I think he even calls him like the F word at one
He
point.
does.
And so if Ilya hadn't had that or some other kind of talent that really opened doors for him, uh, I think his outcomes are vastly different.
And I think because his family saw that talent, they saw him as the golden ticket. He's born during the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So you have that historical context as to his family living through that food scarcity, right? There's a lot of awful stuff happening during that time. So like they see this kid as a golden ticket and they put like all their resources into him and possibly completely ignoring
Mhm.
Alexei, right? We're gonna focus on
Mhm.
him. You'll benefit from this, but like, fuck you, kind of like hang out to
Mhm.
the side. And I think that's obviously another reason why he's so resentful of Ilya
Mhm.
because he
Mhm.
took everything and now he owes them. We gave you everything, we put everything in you, and now you owe us for the rest of your
Mhm.
life.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mhm. So
Yeah.
like the hockey element, his sheer talent, his physicality is actually protective in his
I don't know
balance
what the
of
word is, but like I think it's protective, but it also is something that causes some great pain
yeah.
because of how much it matters to his family's well-being. So I want to go to this one scene in Sochi because he and Shane just slept together for the first time ever and they have this beautiful moment and then the Olympics happens, and then Ilya just completely blows him off, right? And a lot of viewers see that moment as like Ilya being an asshole. And I remember watching that prior to that moment where Shane tries to like talk to him. Ilya loses to Latvia. We know already his family is going to be on top of him. They're going to call him a loser, all sorts of horrible things. What we see in Sochi is Ilya standing up at the bleachers. Shane is kind of like looking up at him, and we see the text messages from his brother, right? Like, where are you? Why aren't you picking up? Dad is so fucking mad. So, we're on purpose given that background and yet people still don't understand why Ilya is so abrasive when Shane comes up to talk to him. You got to put that in perspective. Not only did he just lose the Olympics in the very beginning, but like we're in Sochi. This is only 8 months after Putin put in the gay propaganda law, right? He called homosexuality propaganda, outlawed it. If you are gay in public, whatever that means, it's literally just like holding hands. Like, you can be arrested, fined, and for anyone who's like a foreign national, especially all those Olympians, there could just be deported. So when Shane comes up to him and says, "Hey, are you okay?" Ilya's like, "Go away. We are not safe." He can't actually have a full-blown conversation, but he's very quickly trying to be like, "Go away. No, I didn't answer your boring text," because he understands that bad things can happen, right? The worst thing that could happen to Shane is he could be deported. But the worst thing that could happen to Ilya is arrest, prison, or worse. Remember, he's like, I don't want to know what could happen to me. He's not trying to be an asshole. He's trying to make sure they're both safe in this very, very volatile situation. I think that plays like very well into the this vulnerability level.
Mhm.
So, I don't know, I just thought
Yeah.
that scene specifically was a very, like, interesting window into this
But
whole
as a
framework.
viewer, we know things that Shane doesn't know. And I think
Right.
that the expectation that in that moment, Ilya would be able to be like the most mature or whatever and be like, let me explain, right? But we all know that when our stress levels are really high, we don't always cope well. And in that
Right.
moment, he's getting hit from all sides. And in that moment, he's like, no, like not one more
Mhm.
thing. I can't also bubble
Mhm.
wrap you right now. Right. And so
Mhm.
I see that.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
his what would you say is that like maladaptive coping when he's just
Well,
like,
I think
"Go
you could say
away?"
it either way. Like you could say
Mhm.
if in that moment what's really important to him is maintaining this relationship with Shane, then it is maladaptive coping. But you could also see
Mhm.
it from another angle and say it's adaptive in a maladaptive
Mhm.
environment, right? So, like,
Mhm.
Yep.
given all the stressors that are coming his way and the fact that he's got more challenges than supports in that moment, maybe what
Mhm.
he needed at that moment was no, we're not
Yeah.
doing this right now. And but
Mhm.
because that's not his pattern, that doesn't become his that's not his identity. That is not
Mhm.
how his emergent identity isn't somebody who shuts other people down. At least he doesn't shut Shane down. We don't see that. That's a one-off,
Mhm.
right? And I think we have to
Mhm.
be gentle with one another. We all do that sometimes. We all have meltdowns.
Yeah.
But if you always do that, then that becomes your identity. Then you are an
Mhm.
asshole.
Right,
You
right.
I'm trying to really understand what emergent identity looks like. I always thought of Tampa and All Stars as sort of an entirely transformative weekend. And one of the things that I was thinking about, because we talked about it last time, was Shane coming to Tampa. And there's a significant outward change in Shane. Like he's more confident. You said he had a stylist like a bunch of times last time, right? Like, and that was like the outward manifestation of sort of this inner confidence. The shoe is on the other foot. Now he's asking Ilya to come up to, his room, or like he's making the moves. Ilya, though, comes to I always thought of Tampa and All Stars as sort of an entirely transformative weekend
Mhm.
for both of them.
Mhm.
But what I now think of in this sort of PVEST idea is that we actually see Shane sort of transformed as he comes into Tampa, right? Like thinking about it in the emergent identity framework.
Right.
And then I'm looking at Ilya. So the interaction before this was the club scene where there was zero transformation. Ilya's like hopping back into his old ways, compartmentalizing, being sexually provocative, and he wants Shane, but
The
he's not.
reactive
He's
coping.
extremely reactive coping, right? So
We've become
then,
experts, Tab.
yeah. So
I love
now
it.
he's coming into Tampa and he could start there, but I don't think he does. Like, even in the all-star scene at the bar, he is swallowing that beer and he's like, okay, he's like girding himself, but he's girding himself to have a conversation, not leaving. Right. And he doesn't have
Mhm.
the like lubrication of alcohol and the club. And he could have just laughed, but he knows he's going to be on his team the whole weekend. He knows he's captain. So, okay, so fine. His conversation with Shane is a little stilted, yes, but Shane is like smoothing this over. Through the whole weekend, you see him far more open than than I feel like we've seen him. And then when he has these serious conversations with Shane, he is reticent in the beginning, but it doesn't take a lot of prodding for him to open. I wonder what happened to Ilya in those few months between the club and Shane that
Mm,
allowed this emergent identity to come out, because it could have not. So
mhm,
we see Shane transformed because we see the coming out, we see these key moments, but we don't see that perspective for Ilya. And I wonder, like, what happened? Like, what happened to him? Or was it just a perfect spot? That's what I wonder. He came transformed.
No, he wasn't. He was
His
not
emergent
transformed.
identity was available at that weekend. So it happened in one weekend?
Yes, it
No.
happened during that conversation with Shane. Here's what I see. We see the Tuda meltdown. Shane leaves and breaks his heart, right? In that episode, in that moment, Ilya went all out. He's like, I'm husband material. Check me
Mm.
out, right? Shane, at the end of it, breaks his heart, leaves. And then within like a week, gets a girlfriend. And so between Tampa and Tuna Meltdown and the club scene, that is only like 2 months. And the entire 2 months, Ilya spends watching Shane and Rose online. He's following them on social media. He's at the gym watching them. He is not transforming into being ready to talk to Shane. He is the opposite. He's like, I'm done. I want to get laid. I'm going to the club. Sees him at the club. Now it's even worse because there he sees him like actually be very physical with Rose, right? The club and the tuna meltdown did not result in Ilya wanting to talk to Shane and be open with him. It resulted in being extremely safeguarded. He realizes they're going to have a conversation of some sort because he doesn't know that he's not with Rose at that point. He has no idea. He asks like in 4 different ways what's going on with Rose. What transforms him is Shane saying Rose and I are not compatible. So he didn't come that weekend ready to mend things with Shane. He came to that weekend believing that Shane is still with Rose, believing that Shane is no longer his. And once he gets the confirmation that Shane and Rose are not compatible, then you see that lifted. That's when the chemistry starts to like build up more. Even in the room, he is trying to push Shane away because that is his reactive coping. He's coping by saying, yeah, nothing happened. What, you ran away? He's using Ilya's stereotypical coping mechanism, putting up a wall, being stoic, using like dark humor to try to, he's protecting himself because he was already hurt. So I disagree. I don't think he comes ready and willing to
I
make,
feel like you're proving my point, though, and this is what I'm talking
you said
about.
he was ready before he
No,
got there, but he
no.
wasn't.
No, I said he was transformed. I'm not talking about what he wants from Shane. I'm talking about how Ilya presents himself. I'm talking about his sense of self. Something has changed before he arrives. And I say that because he is demonstrating clear vulnerability in every moment of that interaction in the All Star. He knows he is on the back foot. He has never, ever been in the back foot of this relationship, ever.
Okay.
He has
Yeah.
always been, and he goes with it. His reactive coping is to immediately disengage from that. It is to assert his dominance like he did in the club. He knows, I think, even before Shane came out, that Shane was not bi like he was, that the interaction he was having with the woman was tepid compared to like he knows, and he knows he's being hotter with this woman than Shane. That is the dominance he would assert. He did not do that. Every interaction was met from a place of I am behind you. Like haven't caught up to where you are. And I think that's what I mean by transformation. I'm not saying that he thought he was going to get back together with Shane. That's not what I mean the relational openness that he shows. He allowed himself to be vulnerable, not caught up, and still open. That's what I mean. I
Okay.
don't think he
I agree
arrived
with that.
ready.
I thought you meant he arrived and like was ready to make amends, not amends, but like was ready and willing to accept Shane. Like I don't think that's true, but I do
No, I
agree
think
that
he
he
arrived
was way more
open.
vulnerable
Yeah.
and open than he has ever been.
I do think in some ways it works. I think actually it works from both of your perspectives, right? So when
Probably.
I think about
She's the peacemaker in this group.
sorry, well,
As
no,
usual.
but when I think about Bronfenbrenner as the target, it's like an aerial view on your development. So you're
Right.
seeing all of, the microsystem, the exosystem, the macrosystem, like you kind of can see all those bidirectional influences, the whole system. You're looking at the system. This is like you're wearing a GoPro, right? And you're like following these people literally through their eyes, through their phenomenological perspective. You got to feel what it feels like to be in his skin, to be part of his culture, to interact with the world and the way he's interacting with the world. That's what PVEST is really asking you to do. It's asking you to kind of like really see development through the eyes of the person. And I think what you're describing, well, there's two things. One is I don't think there's from a PVEST perspective, there's like a transformational moment. So how you transform, like your emergent identity comes from patterns of coping, right? Like Ilya, for instance, uses a lot of humor, and that works for him. And so that's his pattern of coping. And so part of his identity is that he's this guy who can, he jokes and, oh, you're boring and you're this and you're that. And for the most part, that works for him. And so that becomes part of his identity. That's who he is, right? And his outcome, sort of like his identity outcome is like that's part of who he is, right? So then that becomes part of, because it's cyclical, right, feeds into the risk, the net vulnerability. So that works for the most part until it doesn't work, right? And so now if you're in a situation where the joking doesn't work, how are you going to cope with that? right? So like now you're joking around and maybe Shane, your partner or your mom or your brother or whatever, whoever it is upset by that. And you've got, now how do you cope with that? Do you get defensive or do you adjust? Because in that moment you're like, oh, something else is needed. If you get in the habit of, like, if you're an empathetic person and you can make adjustments, that then feeds into like a new aspect of your identity, right? So like new emergent identities. And so I think, Anusha, what I hear you identifying is that the way in which Ilya really operated as being like more dominant, as being sort of the driver of the relationship, all of a sudden it changed a little bit and he had to figure out how to cope in that moment. Like, do I still want to drive the car or do I want to step back and be like, okay, what does this mean in relation to Shane? And am I willing to change the way I interact a little bit in response to how this relationship is evolving? Right. And so is that sort of what you're
Yeah,
identifying?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But
Thing about it is that the reactive coping is like a well-worn rug. It's entrenched, it's deeply in your bones. For you to step out of those pathways requires something. And what is the something? Right? And that's
perhaps
what
his love. Perhaps his love
maybe.
for Shane. I mean, I think he realized he was in love with him already during the tuna meltdown, but I think seeing him with someone else was really transformative for him. Maybe that's what the one thing you're looking for that happened,
Yeah,
perhaps.
or
Well,
it
also in
could be
relation
the
to Shane, because Shane changed his pattern, right?
yeah.
So Shane, like, so many relationships, the risk of it going away will cause us to go back to patterns that don't serve us. And so
Mm,
Shane got to a point where he was like, I know what I want. And if this relationship can't give me what I want, then maybe it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But because they responded to one another in adaptive ways, because they both prioritize the relationship. And I mean, and that isn't that true for every relationship. Relationships last if the people in the relationship, whether it's friends
Adapt.
or romantic or whatever, are willing to keep evolving with one another, right?
yeah.
It's just that I feel like I could see Shane's change happen because we have his perspective in many
Yeah.
parts leading up. And and maybe it is love. Maybe that like jealousy really made him examine, like, maybe balance the changed, that he was
Mhm.
finally like, "Wow, this is deeper than I thought." Maybe that was it. Maybe it is love. One of the things that I felt like it was just remarkably universal about the way you
Mhm.
describe these elements of development and identity development. One of the things that I feel like is really important to me is this, like, reactive coping, because as someone who has ADHD, I've spent my maybe whole life kind of working on my just smarts, or being able to like hyper focus on an interest, and then I run away from the actual problem and never fix it. And then at some point in your life, like can't outrun your problem. And then you have no coping strategies because you've spent your whole life trying not to develop them. So then what do you do?
But
Fix
I
me,
think you
Tab.
all
What is this therapy, Anusha? Like,
No, but I actually think that you're a good example. I mean, when you talked about this in your neurodiversity episode, I think you're a good example of actually adaptive coping, right? Because lots of kids with ADHD or neurodiversity will accept the label of, lots of people with ADHD get labeled as lazy, right? And so
mm,
if I accept, well, I'm just lazy because doing the work is hard, right? And so I have
mhm,
to be willing to work harder than everybody else to overcome that challenge. And we see that with Ilya. Like he has to work harder than a lot of other people to
mhm.
overcome his challenges. Shane does
And keeps
too in
being
some
called
ways.
lazy.
Exactly,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And so, but he could just be like, well, I guess I'm lazy and just, use drugs and fuck girls and, whatever. Like his life trajectory, his outcomes could be very different if he accepted a different definition of himself, which he could do.
Mm.
That would be really
Mm.
maladaptive coping. And lots of people do it because it is hard. And when other people are defining you, we talked about this last time, that identity is collusion, right? So like we have
Mm.
the feeling how we feel about ourselves, but other people are also treating us a
Mm.
certain way. They're telling us who we
Uh-huh.
are verbally,
Mm.
non-verbally. We talked about that too. Like, is identity ever fixed? Well, it could be, unless you're willing to put in the work, and it's not easy.
I don't, I asked last time, like, what happens when things and systems are contradicting? I have the same question with PVEST. Like, when elements are contradicting, like, what wins out? Like, maybe that's the question about coping that I'm trying to figure out, or is like, how do you reconcile when elements of our identity feel so different?
I don't know. I mean, we talked about this a little bit with Bronfenbrenner, and it's the same here, that there's also bidirectional arrows, right? So if Ilya family's expectations are that he's going to be this high level athlete, and then
Mm.
how does he cope with when he doesn't feel like going to practice, or he's
Mm.
struggling or whatever? He chooses to cope by working harder. He shows up even when he doesn't feel like it. And so then maybe go back to the stress, maybe that alleviates some stress with his
Mm.
father, because his father's like, oh, he's doing well. Right. And so,
Mhm.
so those two things feed each other. And so I think there is something to be said with like what kinds of behaviors get reinforced,
Mm.
what kinds of, what motivates a particular person. So if his father's approval motivates him, then, even though it's harsh, it could also be protective, right? Because that's
Mm.
getting him to adapt in that coping, coping with the pressures of, being a high level athlete, right? And then that feeds into your emergent identity. So now I feel really confident in this space, even though like maybe with my dad, I feel like a big loser. He calls me lazy, but in this other
Mhm.
context,
Mm.
people see me as important, and I'm confident. And so then maybe when other stressful things come up, I approach them with more confidence. Right. And so like there's
Mm.
this
Yeah.
constant interaction between all of
Mm.
these areas. And so I do think that it's just not that simple. There's just too
Mm.
Yeah.
much back and
It's
forth.
not
So
that
let's
simple.
let's finish up with Ilya's life stage outcome. As of this moment, at
Mm.
episode 6, like his life stage outcome is they say I love you to each other. They're at the cottage together. A lot of these adaptive behaviors led them here. It's not perfect, obviously, because they're still,
Mhm.
closeted. They haven't come out, but it's nice end to the first arc of
Mhm.
his cycle
Mhm.
where he finally is able to be vulnerable, finally really share his feelings. The first one to say I like you and the first one to say I love you, which
Mhm.
really shows such growth for him. So, that's a really decent outcome for him at this
Yeah.
point
Like
that we see.
Mhm.
he's like a legitimately supportive partner, and
Mhm.
he's
Mhm.
on his way to integrating his public and private life. We
That's a
talked
huge
about this
one.
with Shane, and I think it's also true for Ilya, that is one of the biggest sources of stress, is this
Yeah.
double life, right? And so moving in the direction of integrating your public and private life could really be I'm gonna not on purpose, a game changer for
Mhm.
for truly
Yeah.
positive life stage outcomes.
Right,
Yeah.
like, they're physically thinking about moving closer to each other. I mean, that's, like, a huge thing, right? His footing with Shane is still new in terms of if you think about pathways to citizenship and, like, making permanence and a permanent home. Like, he is, like, on the cusp of a lot of change, right?
Mhm.
Mhm. All of these frameworks allow us to just really understand people at a very deep level, but
Yeah.
also like hold our judgment, perhaps not say like he's such an asshole when you see him for the first like 20
You're just
minutes or
not
whatever.
gonna let that go. I mean, it's
I'm
like, I
never going to
see
let
it's a
that go.
dig. In honesty, too, there's something about the alliteration of Ilya apologist, like, the flow of that just
It's
felt good.
sexy. Yeah,
I
it's
know, I
really good.
just
You
like
called
that.
me Ilya apologist, and I think my insides, I saw them like catch on fire. Like someone lit a match and I was just like, I need to walk away from this situation immediately because my maladaptive tendencies were going to come out. It's important to understand why people are the way they are
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
withholding that judgment.
And maybe
Yeah.
that's the approach, right? Like talking about your life stage. Like if you thinking about you have to change your environment or you have to change the way you approach your environment, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's the only way you can move forward. The thing is, if you can really understand what makes people tick, it might actually help you try to figure out how to create the environment they need to change.
Mhm.
Maybe. That's
And support
all
one
nice in
another.
theory.
Thank you so much, Tab, for coming on this show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tab.
So I could have discussed this for another couple of days. We don't have enough time to talk about Ilya, but I could talk about him for quite some time, don't you think?
Yeah, and I'm just really fascinated by the developmental psychology aspect of it. Just a different way to think about not just the show, but also kind of maybe real life applications. Is that like too crazy to say, right?
No, I
Like
don't think that's crazy at all. I mean, this is a
yeah.
real life framework, so we're just
Yeah.
using it for, fictional characters, but it could be
Yeah.
applied to anyone that we know.
Yeah.
In fact, I think next weekend when we get together, we should just do it to all our friends. I'm sure they
That's
would love
right.
it.
I'm sure they'd love to be analyzed in this way. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Speaking of our friends, do you want to talk about our sunshine this week? What's your sunshine?
Yeah. So mine is anticipatory sunshine
Mhm.
because you already had your first Flyers game experience, but I have
Yes.
not. So I'm going with my family to see the Flyers this weekend. And the best part is we're going to be in the gritty section. Do you know about this?
I
Yeah.
do know. Yeah, yeah. I know you were
Yeah.
looking forward to this. Yeah, because your daughter loves gritty, right?
Yes, my daughter does love gritty. So I'm very excited about this experience. So
That's
I'll let you
awesome.
know how it compared to yours.
Yeah, I'm excited for that. My moment of sunshine is also, I guess, anticipatory. We're
Mhm.
going to DC this weekend to visit some colleges with my daughter. So that's going to be
Oh, that's
exciting.
huge. My
Yeah,
gosh.
so that's my moment of
Exciting.
sunshine. And hopefully it'll remain a moment of sunshine after
Yeah.
we're
I
done.
was going to say college visits can be very, very emotional as well as exciting. So,
Yeah, I think so. Next week on Everyone Deserves Sunshine, we're talking about allyship part 2.
because we can never talk enough about allyship.
Correct. Yes. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you want to say hi to the girls in the crease, find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at Everyone Deserves Sunshine.
Or email us at everyonedeservesunshine@gmail.com. New episodes drop on Mondays.
See you then.